The caste system that never was. Colonial invention of Shudra oppression written by Aditi Joshi. The myth of systematic Shudra oppression emerged less from Indian realities and more from colonial propaganda and machinations, designed to distort fluid social dynamics to legitimize foreign rule and undermine Hindu civilization's complexity and resilience. One of the most enduring colonial narratives about India is that Hindu society was built on the systematic oppression of Shudras, the so-called lowest rung of the Varna order. According to this story, for millennia, Shudras were denied education, political power, and social dignity, living only as hewers of wood and drawers of water until the British supposedly liberated them. This trope, repeated endlessly in colonial writings, missionary tracts, and later by Marxist historians, was not merely an academic claim. It became a political weapon to portray Indian civilization as inherently unjust, stagnant, and in need of salvation through either Western liberalism or Christianity. This picture, however, collapses the moment it is confronted with historical evidence. Far from being passive victims of an eternally oppressive system, Shudras and communities classified today as OBCs or scheduled tribes often held political sovereignty, enjoyed access to education, and demonstrated remarkable social mobility. Dynasties such as the Shudra origin Satavahanas in the Deccan, the Yadavas of Devagiri, and later peasant warrior polities like the Marathas and Jats stand as testimony to the fact that political power was never the monopoly of a single Varna. Even in regions where Brahmanas were cultural custodians, rulers frequently emerged from agrarian, pastoral, or artisan backgrounds, hardly a sign of a permanently closed hierarchy. Similarly, the claim that Shudras were barred from education dissolves under scrutiny. Epigraphic records and literary references show that artisanal and agrarian communities often maintain their own paths, halas, and gurukulas. Sanskrit inscriptions sometimes record donations by guild leaders and agriculturists, indicating their participation in the broader intellectual and ritual life of society. In southern India, evidence suggests that Shudra and lower caste students learned Ayurveda, astrology, and temple architecture. In medieval Maharashtra, many non-Brahmana saints, such as Tukaram, Chakamila, and others, articulated a profound philosophical and devotional literacy that would have been impossible if education had been categorically denied to them. In reality, the image of a rigid, oppressive caste pyramid was less a historical reality and more a colonial construction, born from the British need to govern India through simplification, codification, and division. By reducing the fluid, locally diverse, and context-specific Varnajati framework to a single ladder of high and low, colonial administrators created a caricature that served their ideological ends. It justified foreign rule as a civilizing mission, empowered missionaries to target the oppressed for conversion, and provided colonial ethnographers with a ready-made schema for classifying and controlling Indian society. What emerges instead, from a sober reading of history, is a picture of dynamism. Communities rose and fell in status depending on land ownership, military strength, and cultural patronage. Social mobility was real, though differently structured than in modern liberal societies, and the so-called lowest groups were not universally excluded but were active participants in shaping India's political, cultural, and spiritual landscape. The colonial construction of a caste prison. When the British consolidated their rule in India, they sought to present Indian society as decayed, stagnant, and unjust. This framing was not accidental. It served two crucial functions. Justification of rule. If Hindu society could be depicted as inherently oppressive, particularly to Shudras and lower castes, then British authority could be cast as a benevolent civilizing mission. By claiming that India was locked in timeless barbarism, the colonizers positioned themselves as the liberators who brought equality, progress, and rational governance. This narrative provided moral cover for conquest and exploitation, allowing British officials to claim that they were saving Indians from themselves. Divide and rule. More insidiously, the colonial state realized that social fragmentation was a potent instrument of governance. By recasting India's fluid and overlapping social categories into rigid hierarchies, the British created sharper divisions that could be more easily managed and exploited politically. Communities that had historically experienced mobility, rising through land ownership, martial success, or patronage of temples and learning, were now locked into fixed identities. Rivalries were stoked, resentments amplified, and identities hardened in ways that made collective resistance more difficult. Missionaries and administrators collaborated in this project, transforming what had once been a dynamic and locally varied system of jatis and varnas into the monolithic caricature we now call the caste system. The colonial census became a powerful tool in this re-engineering of society. For the first time, Indians were forced into boxes, each community slotted, codified, and ranked in a strict hierarchy that claimed to be timeless but was, in fact, manufactured in the late 19th century. Entirely new categories, such as depressed classes, were invented, while complex local traditions of social interaction were flattened into a binary of high caste and low caste. This colonial taxonomy was then looped back into education, law, and policy, producing a feedback effect. The more it was enforced, the more real it appeared. Over time, what had been a British-imposed classification system came to be internalized by Indians themselves, shaping modern politics and identity in ways that continue to echo long after the empire's end. Shudras in education. Dharma's revelations, perhaps the clearest refutation of the denied education myth, comes from Dharma's The Beautiful Tree, a landmark work that collates British administrative surveys of indigenous schools in the early 19th century. Drawing on the meticulous records of collectors and officials, Dharma demonstrated that India's educational landscape before colonial disruption was far more widespread, localized, and inclusive than the stereotypes suggest. Take the Madras Presidency as an example. Early surveys revealed a strikingly broad social base in school enrollment. Brahmins, 20 to 25%, other upper castes, 10 to 15% Shudras, and other non-Brahmin groups. Often 40 to 50% or more similar figures surfaced in Bengal and Punjab. British officials, who had expected to find literacy restricted to Brahmins, were astonished by the extent of participation among agrarian, artisanal, and pastoral groups. Some even admitted, reluctantly, that the diffusion of basic education in India compared favorably to conditions in Britain at the time. If education had truly been systematically denied to Shudras for millennia, how then do we explain their substantial presence in these pre-colonial schools? The numbers alone dismantle the colonial stereotype. They reveal instead a decentralized but deeply rooted culture of learning in which village schools, pathshalas, and gurukulas offered access across caste lines. Literacy was not confined to an elite priesthood but was embedded in the fabric of local communities, sustained by contributions from peasants, merchants, artisans, and rulers alike. The uncomfortable truth for colonial ideologues was that India's indigenous system of education did not fit the narrative of an oppressive, Brahmin-dominated monopoly. It was more egalitarian and more widely distributed than they wished to acknowledge. To preserve the myth, they downplayed this evidence, dismantled the traditional networks of schools through neglect and new taxation policies, and replaced them with a state-controlled system designed to produce clerks for the Raj rather than educated citizens for a self-sustaining civilization. Thus, the so-called backwardness of Indian education was not a product of Hindu society, but a direct consequence of colonial disruption. What Dharma's archival excavation reveals is not simply statistics. It exposes how a thriving, inclusive system was erased and then misrepresented to justify imperial rule. Shudra and tribal princes. The evidence of princely states at the time of British paramountcy offers yet another decisive blow to the colonial myth of Shudras and tribal groups as eternally subjugated. Out of the 584 princely states documented by the British, a striking number were ruled by communities that colonial ideologues and later Marxist historians would dismiss as lower castes or backward classes. Holkars of Indore. The Holkars, one of the great Maratha houses, rose from the Dangar community, shepherds, today classified as OBC. From humble pastoral origins, they carved out sovereignty and patronized temples, education, and the arts. Koli states, no fewer than 39 princely states were ruled by Kalis, a community today listed as OBC or ST in Gujarat and Maharashtra. Their presence as sovereign rulers starkly contradicts the colonial image of Kalis as criminal tribes or marginal groups. Rajgans of Chhattisgarh. the Rajgans, an Adivasi community, established extensive polities with advanced irrigation and water management systems, testifying to their sophistication in governance and statecraft. Kalars of Pudukkottai and Maravars of Ramnad, communities now stigmatized as denotified or backward, held independent sovereignty in Tamil regions, fielding armies and engaging in diplomacy with both neighboring powers and European traders. These cases, drawn not from nationalist imagination but from the British government's own memoranda, gazetteers, and political surveys, demonstrate beyond doubt that Shudra and tribal groups were not merely integrated into the political order, but frequently embodied sovereignty. They wielded power, patronized culture, and commanded respect in ways utterly inconsistent with the narrative of millennia-long oppression. The diversity of ruling houses alone undercuts the idea of a rigid, unchanging caste pyramid. Political legitimacy in India was not fixed by birth, but rather negotiated through landholding, military prowess, ritual patronage, and popular support. Communities that began as cultivators, herders, or local clans could, and often did, rise to the level of kingship. In other words, social mobility was not the exception, it was the pattern. Caste is fluid, not fixed. The cases above highlight a crucial truth. Caste status in pre-colonial India was not an immovable prison but a negotiable and dynamic reality. Communities could, and often did, shift their social standing across generations, leveraging military achievement, political patronage, ritual honors, landholding, or cultural assimilation to climb the ladder of prestige. The story of mobility and power in early modern India is vividly illustrated by communities whose origins seemed far removed from royalty. Take the Holkars, for instance. Born among the Dangars, a pastoral community of shepherds, they first carved their reputation on the battlefield in service to the Maratha Peshwas. Through loyalty, skill, and sheer persistence, they shed the image of rustic herders and stepped into the world of dynastic politics, ultimately rising to become one of the foremost Maratha ruling houses. The Jats of Bhartapur followed a different, yet equally compelling path. Anchored in agrarian life, these farming clans consolidated strength in the fertile plains of northern India. By the 18th century, they had transformed their agricultural base into a foundation for political sovereignty. Claiming descent from Krishna himself, they not only secured recognition as Kshatriyas, but also reframed their identity to match the grandeur of kingship, legitimizing their hold on power through both lineage and military might. Far to the south, the Kalars of Pudukkottai reveal another variation of this pattern. Known as a hardy warrior community, they caught the attention of Vijayanagar princes, who honored their service and conferred upon them the mantle of rulership. What began as local martial prestige thus blossomed into sovereign authority, showing how the sanction of an established power could radically reshape the trajectory of a community's place in the social order. Such examples were not isolated anomalies, but symptomatic of a broader pattern. Across India, rulers frequently emerged from groups outside the so-called upper castes. Once in power, they reshaped their identities through rituals, patronage of temples and Brahmins, and genealogical claims that linked them to prestigious lineages. This mechanism of Sanskritization and political legitimation made caste far more fluid than the colonial imagination allowed. In stark contrast, the British portrayal of caste froze this dynamism into a rigid, pyramidal structure. By treating caste as a permanent, birth-determined prison, colonial administrators erased centuries of evidence showing that social rank was negotiated, contested, and transformable. What they presented as an eternal Hindu reality was, in fact, a colonial distortion designed to deny India the complexity of its own history. While the British froze the narrative by the 19th century, the colonial state had moved from merely describing Indian society to actively codifying it through the lenses of race science and hierarchy. Influenced by European theories of social Darwinism and Aryan racial superiority, British administrators began to treat caste not as a social institution with fluid and negotiable boundaries, but as a biological category rooted in bloodlines. H. Risley, Census Commissioner of 1901, famously declared that caste is a product of race, reducing centuries of cultural, political, and economic mobility to an imagined racial determinism. In this process, local variations and histories of upward mobility were deliberately erased. Communities that had risen to power, whether Marathas, Jats, Rajgans, or Kalars, were stripped of their historical achievements and relegated to rigid categories. A society that had once been dynamic, adaptive, and capable of producing kings, scholars, and saints from across the Varna spectrum was now represented to the world as a frozen, oppressive pyramid. The myth of systematic Shudra oppression was central to this colonial recasting. It served multiple ends at once, delegitimizing Hindu society. By portraying India's indigenous structures as inherently unjust, the British positioned themselves as necessary arbiters of reform, justifying missionary activity. If Hinduism was equated with cruelty and exclusion, then Christianity could claim the moral high ground as the religion of equality and salvation. Fracturing the body politic, by hardening caste identities into permanent, state-recognized categories, colonial policy deepened divisions that had once been fluid and negotiable. These fissures were not an accidental byproduct. They were a deliberate tool of governance. The tragedy is that these colonial constructs outlived the empire itself. What began as a political strategy of control was gradually internalized by Indian society, shaping modern politics, law, and identity. The caste system, as we know it today, owes far more to the classificatory zeal of the British than to the lived realities of pre-colonial India. And the fissures they engineered remain politically useful even now, ensuring that the colonial project continues to cast its long shadow over independent India. Restoring historical balance, the cumulative evidence from education records, princely states, and the lived texture of social history makes one thing clear: Shudras were not universally oppressed or excluded. They studied in schools, governed kingdoms, built irrigation and water systems, led armies, composed devotional poetry, and negotiated their place within the Varna framework with remarkable fluidity. Yes, there were episodes of hierarchy, exclusion, and localized restrictions. No society in human history has been free of them. But to extrapolate these instances into a pan-Indian, millennia-long system of systematic oppression is to distort the past beyond recognition. Such a sweeping narrative is not history, but ideology, a colonial myth that has, over time, ossified into modern common sense. To undo this falsehood is not an exercise in nostalgia, but a necessary act of intellectual decolonization. It requires us to look past the categories and caricatures imposed by the colonial state and rediscover the dynamism of India's own social processes. The truth is more complex, more nuanced, and ultimately more empowering. Despite hierarchies, Indian society created spaces for education, mobility, and sovereignty across communities, including those now labeled Shudras. In acknowledging this, we do not deny the existence of inequality. We reject the colonial fantasy that inequality was absolute, timeless, and unchangeable. What emerges instead is a portrait of a civilization that was adaptive, contested, and alive, a society where identities could be reshaped, power could be seized, and dignity could be claimed. That recognition is not merely about correcting the past. It is about liberating the present.